Is Lane Kiffin just an older version of Eli Drinkwitz? Let's talk about it on this special edition of Locked On Ole Miss.
You are Locked On Ole Miss, your daily podcast on the Ole Miss Rebels. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Well, howdy toddy, all you Ole Miss Rebels fans. Obviously, I am John Miller from Locked On Mizzou, guest hosting here for Stephen Willis, as he is on the mend here these days. Best wishes out to Stephen, of course. All you Locked On Ole Miss fans, be sure to send some love Stephen's way for sure. But I'm here with you today to talk about some Rebel basketball, what I think very well could be a new golden era for that program, and why I, as a Mizzou fan, frankly, need a couple games with Ole Miss football on my calendar very, very soon. But you know what? I want to start the program here by just talking about what I think are the parallels, not only between the Mizzou and Ole Miss football programs, but really I think the two coaches at the two respective schools. To me, Eli Drinkwitz is basically a younger, less conventionally attractive version of Lane Kiffin, in my opinion. Really, think about it for a second. You got the visors, you got the constant junk talk on the internet. Two of the great modern trolls, especially among football coaches, are Eli Drinkwitz and Lane Kiffin. And plus, I think both guys are really taking their programs to new heights. And certainly I'll give it to Kiffin so far. He is more accomplished than Drinkwitz is. But again, there's a few years there, about 10, I believe, that Kiffin has on Drinkwitz. I just think historically and currently, it's kind of interesting how much these two programs have in common. Of course, Missouri hasn't won a conference championship outright since 1969. The Rebels haven't won the SEC since 1963. And yet, of course, in recent years, especially 23, 24, both programs just right on the cusp of really starting to knock on the door of being one of the A-type programs in all of college football. Of course, right on the cusp of the college football playoff as well. And I have to admit, I knew last season was a tough finish for the Rebels, but when I was doing my research for this particular program, I have to admit I didn't realize that Ole Miss missing the playoff last season was truly one of the all-time bag fumbles I've ever seen. Ole Miss finished number 2 in S&P Plus and somehow didn't make the 12-team playoff field. I mean, my goodness, I knew that Florida game was heartbreaking at the end of the season, but it also just shows, frankly, what a true gauntlet the Southeastern Conference is. But, you know, bottom line is I think both teams last year, Ole Miss would have gotten in at 10-2. Had Missouri won its late season game that I attended in Columbia, South Carolina over the Gamecocks, had Missouri won that, I think it would have gotten in the playoff as well. So, again, just a lot of similarities on where these two programs are just in terms of their trajectory. And if anything, I think one thing, if you look back on it, of course, Drinkwitz hired in 2020, Kiffin hired in 2020 by Ole Miss. You look at what Kiffin has been able to do in this run with the Rebels. This has clearly been his most successful run of his career, I would say. Well, I don't think it's any coincidence, by the way, that 4 years ago, Lane Kiffin has been very open with the fact that he got sober. He stopped drinking. And I don't think it's any coincidence whatsoever that you've seen the best version of Lane Kiffin so far and the best version of Ole Miss Rebels football as well. Now, listen, I'm not telling everybody out there to go be a teetotaler. That's not really my point here. In fact, I like to have a libation every now and again myself, but I just have a lot of admiration for Lane Kiffin being a self-aware enough person to realize not only that he had a problem, but he had to take some serious action there. And as Kiffin has admitted, hey, I'm not a perfect person now by any means. Don't get it twisted, but I think we're definitely seeing the best version of Lane Kiffin that we've ever seen as football fans. So good for Ole Miss for reaping those benefits right now. And again, a little bit more just on Lane, sober Lane, if you will. Man, that's just a tough environment to do it as well. Lord knows, especially in the new environment where, well, you can sell alcohol legally in the stadium now. Even beyond that, I mean, for years, college football and alcohol kind of go hand in hand, especially, well, in the high roller events and suites and everything else where you're going to find the head football coach kissing babies and shaking hands and all that good stuff, glad handing. That's a tough environment if you have a problem with alcohol, to constantly be in social situations where alcohol is a part of it. So good on Lane Kiffin, really. I have a deep admiration for what he's done so far, and keep it up. I know it's a battle every single day. Now, so far, I've been really nice to all of you Rebels fans out there. So now maybe let me get your goat for just a second here, because I do think when I just laid out all the similarities here in the trajectory and history of the Ole Miss and Missouri programs to a large extent, well, I think one thing that I haven't laid out is that I think the odds are a little bit askew right now. Ole Miss 10-1, for example, over at FanDuel Sportsbook to win the Southeastern Conference, where Missouri is 50-1. Again, Ole Miss was definitely better than Missouri last season. I'm not going to argue otherwise. That seems pretty apparent on paper. Were they dramatically better than Missouri? 10-1 versus 50-1 different, because while Missouri is breaking in a new quarterback, well, Austin Simmons is a new quarterback as well. Obviously, Jackson Dart is off to try his hand at the NFL. So I have to admit, I just do not quite understand the disparity there between Missouri's odds and Ole Miss's odds. No offense there, Rebels fans. I just think, if anything, Missouri is undervalued at the moment in the sports books, and especially because I think Missouri and Ole Miss, hey, more similarities here, are absolutely the types of schools that have been benefiting from this new environment. And by the new environment, I mean name, image, and likeness, the transfer portal. I think there's pretty good evidence that my theory played out in college basketball in March Madness, which is quite simply the teams like Missouri, Ole Miss, who are in the Big Ten, the SEC, the two money schools, the two money conferences in particular. Well, if you're just below that top rung of Alabama, of Georgia, those type of teams, well, what I think you're seeing happening is a lot of those, a lot of those players that would have been, say, second stringers at Georgia, for instance, are, well, quite literally, in Damon Wilson's example on the edge for Missouri, he transferred from Georgia to Missouri. That type of stuff wasn't happening in the past. He may well end up being Missouri's best pass rusher this season. That type of player movement just simply wasn't possible in the past. And I think on the margins, at the very least, it's benefiting teams like Missouri and Ole Miss, probably hurting the mid-majors, to be sure. The MAC type of schools, well, it's always hard for those schools to recruit. Now it's nearly impossible for them to keep some of their best players. Whereas at Missouri and Ole Miss, for example, you're kind of in between. You're almost in the perfect zone of, hey, we're big enough that we can attract all types of new talent, and yet not so big that, hey, you're gathering almost too much talent, that type of thing. The point here is that it's evening out, I think, in the big money schools, like in the SEC, in the Big Ten, to a lesser extent, teams like Texas Tech in the Big 12 that have a lot of money swishing around right now too. Some of that landman money, as I like to call it. So my point here is that I just think the SEC this coming season, this isn't even so much about Missouri versus Ole Miss. I just think we're entering a new period of parity here. I think it's just going to be, 2025 in particular with so many new quarterbacks. Saban is out the league, that type of deal. I just think we're in for one of the most unpredictable seasons of SEC football of all time here in 2025. And, of course, Rebels basketball just made its second run to the Sweet 16 ever. And I don't think it's a fluke. I think we're entering a golden era here of Rebels basketball, and I'll tell you why. But first, when it comes to SEC basketball right now, to me, Auburn, of course, who's in the Final Four, Alabama, and to a little bit lesser of an extent, the Ole Miss Rebels, to me, are great examples of exactly what the new era of SEC basketball is all about. Because, well, like Alabama and Auburn in the past, I don't think Ole Miss really cared that much about SEC basketball. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm sure there are diehard fans of Ole Miss basketball. Heck, I've met a few in my day, but there's a heck of a lot more of them these days now that Ole Miss is winning and, yes, spending on basketball. So it's a totally new day when Chris Beard, a big-time coach by any estimation, when the Rebels are able to fend off Texas A&M, speaking of landman money, fend off Texas A&M for a coach that they really, really want. That is impressive stuff. Again, this is the new SEC. I think the idea that the SEC in basketball, well, this is a fluke season or something like that. Don't get me wrong, this may end up still being the best season of SEC basketball for a while, but I think the programs in this league, clearly all of them are trying the very best that they can. The fact that Buzz Williams moved on to Maryland, I think says more about Buzz Williams really than it does about Texas A&M or SEC basketball in general. That's just kind of a Buzz Williams move, in my opinion. But regardless, man, a run to the Sweet 16 for Ole Miss after the Tigers, be honest, kind of handled the Rebels fairly comfortably at Mizzou Arena. So, yes, I am seething with jealousy right now after Missouri was bounced in the first round by Drake. But honestly, I think this is, as long as Ole Miss can keep Chris Beard around, Ole Miss is going to be a problem in this league. And while they obviously haven't gotten the level of Auburn or Alabama yet, give them some time, because Beard got Texas Tech to that level. His one season at Texas basically got the Longhorns to that elite level as well. And yes, there's the ugly situation that happened with Chris Beard off the court. Quite honestly, I'm not even going to go into that because I don't have all the details for you, so it would seem unfair to even go into all that stuff. I'll just tell you this, basketball-wise, the guy can coach. He made Texas Tech into a national power, for crying out loud. By the way, speaking of Texas Tech, when I was going back through my research here, remember when Bob Knight made Texas Tech take his son Pat as his successor? My goodness. You thought Bronny James was a case of nepotism. They made Pat Knight stick around in Lubbock for 3 years of basically last place basketball. Pretty incredible, but I digress. I just think that Ole Miss impressively has a real chance here to now be one of the elite programs in the SEC, definitely top half of the league consistently here for, again, as long as Chris Beard is here. And occasionally I've seen people make fun of Ole Miss's relatively new arena, I believe opened in 2016, the John Black Pavilion, as I like to call it, as a Days of Our Lives fan. But 9,500 people is pretty small, especially compared to, well, Missouri's Mizzou Arena, 15,000. But I'll be honest, I like the tiny arena, especially for the vast majority of your games. 9,500 people is probably plenty. especially for those non-conference games early in the season. The building's going to seem a lot more lively and exciting when there are 8,000 people in a 9,500-seat arena versus 8,000 people in a 15,000-seat arena. Feels pretty cavernous, as we Missouri fans can account. Now, don't get me wrong, when the Tigers are good and every SEC game is sold out with 15,000, it's an absolutely incredible atmosphere. But I actually like the idea, especially where Ole Miss was all the way back a decade ago, plus when they decided to make this decision to break ground on this new arena. I think it was the right move at the time, and who knows what the landscape of college basketball and live attendance is going to look like in 10 years. Frankly, I think it's better to be a little bit more on the conservative side, whereas Missouri 20-some-odd years ago was obviously more on the aggressive side. I would err on the side of caution. So I can't say I'm making fun of Ole Miss nor the fabulously named John Black Pavilion. And despite all the similarities between Eli Drinkwitz and Lane Kiffin, well, those two have yet to meet on the field as head coaches. And yes, despite all of the barbs that they seem to, jokingly and lightheartedly fire back at each other on social media, again, no actual competition on the field. And oddly enough, again, despite all of the, I think, similarities between the two programs, not much history in the SEC. The Tigers have been in the Southeastern Conference for 13 years now, just 2 games against Ole Miss. Of course, the timing for Ole Miss, oddly enough, the Rebels just 1-7 against Missouri. Just strange timing, I would say, for Ole Miss, as well, the Rebels happened to play two of the great Missouri teams of all time in 2007 and 2013. Also, the 2019 game in Columbia, that homecoming affair, that was definitely the peak of Missouri's season that year, as the second half of the season, the wheels completely fell off for Missouri, and Barry Odom would end up getting fired that season, leading to Drinkwitz the very next year. Also, 78, another great Missouri and very memorable Missouri season where the Tigers beat Ole Miss 45-14. But again, oddly enough, a couple games in Jackson here where Ole Miss picked up its lone victory in 74, a 10-0 victory in Jackson over Mizzou. So some strange timing and some surprisingly bad history there for the Rebels against the Tigers. Regardless of that long ago history, it's just shocking to me that since entering the SEC that these two exciting teams with two interesting, prominent coaches have only faced off twice and never these coaches against each other. I'm going to be shocked and frankly saddened if in the next scheduling cycle starting in 26, if it isn't back-to-back, it's not road and away, Oxford and Columbia in 26 and 27 in some combination, I think we're making a mistake here. Not only just from a lot of different perspectives, I think from the conference's perspective, these are teams that should have more history than that by now. We're 13 years deep into this thing. There are teenagers that have never seen these games basically ever played at this point. So, let's get it together, SEC. We need the Rebels and the Tigers in 26 and 27. And while the Rebels, I think, definitely are one of the net winners of the transfer portal process, well, they aren't all winners, are they? Obviously, Kenshawn Judkins transferred to Ohio State the previous offseason. That one had to sting a little bit for Rebels fans, but I'm just curious. From my perspective, I got to be honest, I'm a little bit surprised by how little most fans seem to care about the player movement, at least when it comes to, well, their actual eyeballs and butts in the seats, that type of thing. So I want to talk about that and also the first time I met Stephen Willis. But first, and now it's time for another segment of Locked On Ole Miss. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. I just love the first down Ole Miss thing. That's one of the great PA calls currently happening in football, without a doubt. But I do think it's interesting that this whole portal process, I have to be honest, 3-4 years ago when it all began and Missouri had lost a couple prominent players, Dominic Lovett, the receiver, to Georgia, previously Mekhi Wingo, a big-time defensive lineman, transferred to LSU that season. So maybe this is just easy for me to say now in recent years where the Tigers really haven't lost anybody terribly prominent in the portal outside of, I guess, Williams Winery, the freshman this past offseason. But I was always saying, I'm a hardcore fan. I'm in. I'm going to be rooting for the Tigers no matter what. But is this not going to turn off people a little bit, just the constant player movement? Is that not going to be something that turns off newer fans and almost confuses them a little bit? Well, it turns out not really, especially, I guess, for programs like Ole Miss and Missouri where they're still winning. It's not as though I wonder about, I have a friend who is a Vermont Catamounts basketball fan, for example. He lives up in Essex Junction, Vermont. Well, obviously Vermont has had some fun Cinderella type of runs in the NCAA tournament. I'm just wondering how much more difficult, as many people are, that's going to be in a world where if Vermont happens to have a late bloomer, a great player who is under the radar for whatever reason. Well, speaking of Drake and Missouri, Drake's best player, Bennett Sturts, hey, he was there for a season after 2 seasons at Division II Northwest Missouri State. Well, now he's off to Iowa. So the point is, you'd think if he were hanging around college basketball, you'd get another year traditionally if you're Drake out of Bennett Sturts. Well, that's no longer happening. So I think for the mid-majors, it does have to be kind of a bummer to be a mid-major fan right now. And it would be harder if I were a young person to sort of jump on that bandwagon as my friend did, the Vermont bandwagon, and all of us did on the Ole Miss and Missouri bandwagons all those years ago. So I do feel a little bit bad for the teams that are further down the rung, but I have to say I'm sort of surprised and maybe just happy that it doesn't seem to be affecting any SEC schools whatsoever at this point. And by the way, I did think it was kind of funny. The very first time I ever met Stephen Willis, I had some expectations. Listen, I didn't know what to expect, of course, because I had met Stephen, but I had all of my listeners, well, they are not fans of Stephen, at least at the time, because in 2023, the end of the season, well, this was before the 12-team playoff. Missouri and Ole Miss were sort of right on the cusp of being in that final 4-team playoff. And, well, Stephen was, as you know he likes to do, making his case very passionately that Ole Miss deserves to be in over Missouri. So Stephen, being the smart guy that he is, realized, hey, this topic is getting some heat here and some listeners. Let's bring on old John Miller to hash it out. And, well, I had all my listeners saying, oh man, this Willis guy, you got to come hard, man. You can't let him get away with anything, that type of deal. And when you know it, I enter the StreamYard, and Stephen Willis is, well, Mr. Southern Hospitality, Mr. Polite, all that good stuff. We have a great back and forth on the show, and we've had a lot of fun on the SEC squad over these last few weeks as well. So, gotta say, I'm happy to be here for Stephen. Hopefully Stephen is on the mend as you're listening to this. All the thoughts and prayers in the world out to him on his continuing recovery. And, hey, hopefully you've enjoyed this episode. If you want to hear some more about Mizzou, especially if the Tigers and the Rebels actually play football here sometime in the next 100 years or so, check me out at Locked On Mizzou anywhere on social media. Or if you want to listen to the podcast, it's Locked On Mizzou, YouTube, and wherever you listen to your podcasts. So thanks for making Locked On Ole Miss your first listen every day. For your second listen, check out Locked On College Basketball with Isaac Shade and Andy Patton. Of course, March is here. In fact, April is here as you're listening to this. So be the most informed fan of college basketball throughout the madness. Find Locked On College Basketball on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So thanks for having me here on Locked On Ole Miss. I'm John Miller. See y'all later.